You know, over the past few weeks, we have been discussing various models of psychotherapy. And it's important to understand that many clinicians use elements of different versions of therapy. But today, I kind of want to change the focus. And we started changing the focus when we started to look at feminist-based models and then family-based models. And I want to continue that theme of trying to look beyond the individual and trying to understand the value systems of various cultures. So today, we're going to go through a journey on the concept of multicultural counseling. So I'm going to pull up my slideshow and we will begin. But when you think of, culture is a very broad construct. So we're going to go into it, and hopefully as you start or continue to work with your clients, it's going to help out. So this is one of the final lessons that I have for you. So, all right, let me open the slideshow. And as I said, we're going to talk about multicultural theory and multicultural therapy. And when we understand culture, it's important to understand that our culture impacts our language, how we speak, and the other way around. Language can shape culture. So even if we take these two elements, we have some considerations in mind. We have to be mindful that we live in a multidimensional universe. And if I were to ask you, what is your most important identity characteristic? It is possible for you to pick it out. But, the reality is that we have many overlapping aspects of identity, or we have multiple identities. And what do I mean by that? I am a parent. I am a professor. I am a clinical psychologist. These are all aspects of my identity. But when we think of culture, as we're going to see, we're thinking about things like age. And one's age impacts how they see the world. And one could also engage in something like ageism. And ageism happens at both ends of the spectrum, right? So there are stereotypes about older adults, and there are, adverse hiring practices for middle adults and older adults. Simultaneously, if you are a teenager or you're an emerging adult, so that's 18 to 25, you might have someone say, "What do you know? You're just a kid." Well, when someone does that, they're engaging in a adultism, trying to suggest that you're not yet fully an adult, so your position or opinion should be discounted. So that's just one element, right? But we also have other aspects of identity. And I'm going to go through Pamela Hayes' model, or framework, I should say, the addressing framework, later in the lecture. So I'm not going to list all of them, but let's take a few more just to give a little bit of flavor. Gender, right? Gender is another aspect of identity. We talked about feminism. And when we think of, gender-based minorities, historically, there has been a myth that males were somehow superior. That's not true, right? The male superiority myth, it was endorsed by people like Darwin, Freud, and so forth. But we now know that's false. So, what happened as a function of believing that somehow women are inferior? Well, one thing that happened is that opportunities in education were limited, opportunities in a workforce were limited. So, women, non binary individuals, transgender individuals, these individuals have been historically marginalized. Let's take another one, ethnicity. Ethnicity, right? So, by the way, I should have said you can engage in some form of sexism or genderism, right? Ethnicity and race are linked together, so we tend to say what you could violate is racism, right? So, historically, in the United States, there has been oppression against individuals who identify as Black or individuals or people of color, right? So, being Black in America has historically been challenging. Being Chinese in America has been historically challenging. For example, one of the first laws that deals with race was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that was in the late 1800s. So there's something to think about in terms of how the experience of race, ethnicity, gender, age, all of these shape who we are. And the reality is that you have some identity on each of these factors, right? So in terms of age, I am approaching middle adulthood, right? So for me, that's one of my age-related factors. Gender, I am male, right? Ethnicity, I would be classified as white. So for me, if I were to think about these overlapping aspects of identity, I tend to have a great deal of privilege. But what would happen if you were an older Black female in the United States, and you were to ask someone who is an older adult their experience in their life, it is possible that they can tell you stories pre-integration. It is possible they can tell you their own personal struggles and journey with racism and sexism and the combination of the two. And now that they're older adults, how they're almost invisible in society. So when the client comes to us, we want to listen very carefully to the aspects of their identity that are, being affected by the world we live in. And as clinicians, we also want to make sure that we're appropriately serving individuals and not using a traditional Eurocentric model, because we can get into trouble that way. We can become out of step, right? And that therapeutic alliance could be lost or potentially damaged as a function of, either not being attuned to the unique struggles or trying to stereotype and put people into boxes. One more thing I will say before I actually advance the slide. In grad school, we had to have a course on multicultural counseling. The whole course, the semester was all about working with every different community across the various addressing framework. And one of the things that I was struck by was that even the books that attempt to try and create more nuance about various communities and cultural value systems, that sometimes can be problematic because it almost creates a caricature about a group or a culture. So, that's why I like to listen very carefully and figure out, well, what identity characteristics are most salient for that person? What are being activated? So, and then I listen carefully. So, let's take religion. In Judaism, we have individuals who are Jewish but atheists, which seems like a contradiction. How could you be an atheist and still be Jewish? Well, that's because Jewish identity also has an ethnic identity to it, right? A sociocultural identity to it. So it's tricky. So if I were to say, okay, what do I know about Judaism? And I treat a person who identifies as Jewish but is an atheist as if they were practicing their faith, I would be out of step. I would be using language and assumptions about this individual that is a mistake. So let's start to look at some of these principles. So when we talk about, well, what is culture? The truth is that there are many different definitions of culture. There are many different views of what culture is, but let's go through some of the definitions, right? So culture could be your social practices, whatever institutions for the community, family structures, and daily life. They're all aspects of culture, right? And culture shapes us as to how we believe we should practice and what we believe is considered a good life and what we believe is to be deviant. For example, let's take people who are Muslim. According to the tradition, drinking alcohol is haram, right? It's forbidden. And because it is forbidden, if a person falls short of the values of faith, it is possible that they would be considered deviant through the lens of the faith, even though from a Western point of view, 9 out of every 10 individuals in America will expose themselves to alcohol at one point or another, not necessarily become an alcoholic, but will drink. So that's something to think about. So what does it mean when we look at acceptable practices or the good life and what is considered deviant? So even our diagnostic manual, the DSM, has come under criticism because the various disorders we have, many of them fall short in the discussion of what is considered acceptable practices across culture. So in the DSM-5, there was a greater emphasis on variability of practices across culture so that we don't use a one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, now that's important. What is considered acceptable or unacceptable differs across culture. We're also born into a culture which creates a series of values that are implicit. Most of us, if I were to ask you, well, what are some of your values? If you're a US born individual, you're likely going to share values of individualism, values of independence, values of being assertive. But if you come from another part of the world, you might be more collectivistic. You might be more focused on the whole rather than yourself as an individual. You might not view your life as seeking independence. You might have more of an interdependence, um, and so forth, right? So it's important to know that our values are shaped by where we're born. So that is part of our culture, where we're born. Now, it's interesting to see that our cultural value system can change through time. So children actually belong to a different culture than their parents or than adults, because the value system, this what we call the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, it shifts, it changes. So that's important to know, that time is a factor in culture too. And if you were to think about some of our value systems in the United States, even 50 years ago or 70 years ago, we could see that we tend to reject a lot of these positions today. Now, so what is multiculturalism? So it's broadly defined as the intentionality or the focus of appreciating and validating different perspectives, right? So there is a belief that each culture has strengths, each culture has positive virtues or values and enriching dimensions, right? So it's important when we talk about culture or multicultural counseling, there is a focus on being open to learning about other people's culture, and there is a focus on validating the experience of people from different cultures. And if you don't know about an individual's culture, there is an emphasis on learning and humility, right? So these are elements of multicultural counseling. Now, multicultural theory it's not a specific theory of psychotherapy, but it is a mindset or an orientation, right? So you can apply multicultural orientations to psychoanalysis, to individual psychology, to existential psychology, humanistic psychology, Gestalt psychology, CBT, and so forth, right? You can apply it. And we did criticize, if we go back to some of the previous lectures or discussions we've had, you will see that we evaluated the openness or the historical openness to various things like gender and ethnicity and culture as a whole. So, but you can apply a multicultural orientation across the board. Now, a multicultural counseling or therapy is a helping role, right? And it's a process that uses various modalities to allow our clients to live the most optimal life according to their cultural value system. And this is a paraphrase of Gerald Wing Sue and his brother. They wrote the textbook on multicultural counseling. It's interesting that was the textbook we used in graduate school, and it's good, but it has its own limitations. It's not for this lesson to talk about the limitations of the book, but it's a pretty good book. All right, now, when you apply multicultural therapy, it requires you to, conduct your therapeutic process in a way that is consistent with the client's life, their experience, and their cultural value system. My point of view as a clinician, or the therapist's point of view, comes second, right? So I talked to you about this concept of therapeutic alliance. If we view our role as clinicians as to help people live their life in accordance with their value system, rather than superimposing our value system on them, we would come a long way. So if we were to think about this model, we do talk about things like privilege, right? Privilege as a concept refers to unearned, benefit of the doubt, or things that are given to us by virtue of some identity characteristic rather than really necessarily deserving that, right? So historically, we've talked about the privileged white male. So for example, being male comes with some benefits, right? So if you are the head of a company and you are, giving strong direction to those who work for the company, you would be viewed as assertive. But historically, if you were female and you did the very same thing, you might come across as bossy or being labeled as bossy. So that's a thing. Why is it that a person who's male who leads in a given style gets treated differently than a female who leads in that style, right? So that's something to think about. And then in terms of whiteness or being white, we also have historically viewed whiteness as an area of privilege. But get this, the truth is that this worldview actually has problems too. So referring to the privileged white male, remember there are many aspects of identity, right? So when we talk about socioeconomic status or financial status, there are a lot of people who are poor or working class white males. And when you talk to individuals who are in the low socioeconomic status class, there's a discussion about how can I be considered privileged, right? And the truth is, to some degree, this has been damaging to individuals who have lower socioeconomic status, whether they be white or whatnot. So this privileged white male worldview can actually still be damaging to white individuals, right? And I will qualify that as other than if they're healthy, white, and economically secure, right? So in general, that model, even towards white individuals can be damaging, right? So that I am not trying to dismantle privilege. That is not the purpose of this lecture. It is just an acknowledgement that yes, white individuals have privilege. I'll give you an example. If I were to go into a high-end department store, as I look now, it is likely that people are not going to surveil me or trail me as much as if a person of color did. So there is privilege, but there are also potential biases if we don't look at all elements of identity, right? So be mindful that, let's say you had a white male who is economically secure, but also identifies as a gay male, or an older adult who is a gay male. Well, all of a sudden, that privileged white male worldview or status can come under threat because of other areas of vulnerability. I hope this makes sense. So the goal is to embrace our privilege, acknowledge our privilege on areas where we are in the majority. but also acknowledge our areas of vulnerability when we're in the minority, right? So individual persons of color and females historically have been viewed very negatively, whether we say that they have limited moral potential, as in the case of Kohlberg. He suggested that somehow males did better in moral tasks, or the bell curve, when we talk about persons of color having somehow inferior intelligence. So from a multicultural point of view, believing that Black individuals or persons of color or females have somehow deficient intellectual or moral capacity, from a multicultural point of view, that's very bigoted, right? So, and if we read some of the writings historically, and I'm just only talking about historically, because today we're in a different world. Remember, I said time plays a role. But historically, when we look at the physicians and psychologists and counselors, typically the theories or models of counseling were developed using a dominant white European American framework. And as a function of that, the nuance was lost, and it shows tremendous insensitivity towards individuals of diverse communities. Now, one example is colorblindness. I have heard some of my colleagues say, I don't see color. I see a person in front of me, I see a client in front of me, but I don't see color. But when you say that, that actually is inadvertently oppressive. For example, imagine you said, I don't see color to, let's say, an African-American client. When they look in the mirror, do they see color? And when you say, I don't see color, in some ways, you're actually saying, I don't see you. Now, that may not be your intent, right? So we refer to this as unconscious racism or being inadvertently oppressive. But the colorblind phenomenon or perspective suggests that race shouldn't matter. But when you say that, you actually negate or deny the experience of individuals in the minority, and you minimize the experience of racism that occurs. And while you mean this or not, you actually create a system or structure that benefits white individuals rather than people of color. So our unconscious racism or sexism, you could determine that people have blind spots. There are some people who will say to you, well, I'm not racist or I'm not sexist. And then in conversation, they might say something that sounds racially insensitive or sounds potentially sexist or heterosexist. And it's kind of like, hold on, you believe that you are not racist. You believe that you are not sexist, but there's some spillover. Or if you see a person, again, a person who runs a company, owns a company, and you look at their hiring practices, and there are very few BIPOC individuals. When I use BIPOC, we're referring to Black individuals or people of color. And so you notice that there is some disparity there, or you notice there's not a gender equivalency, or somehow female voices or ideas are minimized. These are unconscious biases. because if you ask a person, they might very well say, wow, I didn't even notice who I hired. I'm colorblind after all, right? I didn't even notice that, there aren't any individuals who are Black or Hispanic or Middle Eastern and so forth. I didn't notice. Well, maybe it was by accident, but if you have a large company and there are these biases that come out, it could be on an unconscious level. And when working with individuals who are in the majority, so the people who possess privilege according to a given identity factor, some of the goal is to help bring forth to the surface unconscious biases, if they exist, right? So it's possible that they don't exist, but if they do exist, our job is somehow to work with a person to acknowledge their privilege. Okay. So when we think of multicultural counseling in psychology, there was a major shift. And I actually want to start the clock earlier. I happen to love history. So I want to think about pre-integration of the schools. Pre-integration of the schools, there was this belief separate but equal, right? And, the argument was that, we can segregate the schools because everybody's going to be treated equally and they're going to have the same opportunities. But in reality, if we were to look at the the ethnic segregated schools prior to Brown versus Board of Ed, the schools did not look the same. For example, you might have a very different teacher to pupil ratio. More specifically, in Black schools, you would have a classroom with maybe 50 kids to one teacher. And in white schools, you would have a classroom that's 25 or 30 students to the teacher. If we were to look at the textbooks, in Black schools, you would have textbooks that the copyright date might be 10, 20 years old. So you might be teaching outdated information or inferior quality books. In white schools, you would see that they were up to date. And this goes on and on and on. I could show you, but there was a psychologist by the name of Kenneth Clark and his wife, Mamie Clark. They were the leading pioneers who did the testimony that this segregation and the societal treatment of Black people resulted in Black children, very young, disliking their identity. And there's the famous doll test where they allowed children to pick a doll, a white doll or a Black doll. And what happens? White children tended to pick the white doll, nothing to see here. But when Black children were picking a doll, they also chose the white doll. Now you might say, okay, well, maybe it's because there weren't as many Black dolls on the market at the time. That's possibly true. But this was an experiment. And they asked how these children viewed the Black doll and Blackness. And there was descriptions of ugly, and somehow there was a self-loathing identity that was created by this segregation. So that landmark testimony resulted in integrating schools. But just because the schools were integrated doesn't mean that it permeated society. So there was still greater emphasis on, discrimination or discriminatory practices. And, you have JFK, who is pushing the Civil Rights Act, and his brother, Robert Kennedy, pushing for more inclusivity. And then Kennedy gets shot in 1963, which leaves Lyndon B. Johnson to continue the term of John F. Kennedy. And what does he do? He moves the Civil Rights Act, and it becomes law. That is the Civil Rights Act. Now, so pre-Civil Rights Act, we had discriminatory practices in the schools. We had discriminatory practices in society. Post-Civil Rights Act, there are laws and protections that are put into place. As people start to dismantle these existing value systems, we also have the Vietnam War going on, and people are starting to learn to rebel or defy the existing structures that are out there and saying maybe it doesn't work entirely. So there was an anti-war effort, anti-establishment effort that starts to happen. And I bring all this up because in that spirit, we start to see identity development models. So we start to see a Black identity development model, a white identity development model. We start to see sexual orientation identity development models. And from the 70s to about the 90s, I would say we only looked at identity development through the lens of one factor. But in the 1990s, we started to become more exposed to this idea of intersectionality, which is the multiple overlapping aspects of identity. All right, so we have the Civil Rights Act. We have psychologists starting to try and understand individual aspects of identity and then overlapping aspects of identity. So this starts to take hold. We start to see the Association of Black Psychologists come up, A.B. Psy, in 1968. And A.B. Psy came about to try and better help psychology reflect the experience of Black individuals, because the existing literature didn't. So the psychological community did not appropriately represent Black people or individuals of color, right? So then we start to see that we have a Council of National Psychological Associations with the emphasis of, or for the advancement of, ethnic minority interests. So we start to have an Office of Ethnic Minority Affairs. The American Counseling Association, which is different than the American Psychological Association, started to develop and endorse multicultural guidelines. And, it's still a work in progress because we now have guidelines for practice with transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. And we have guidelines for practice for boys and men, which is, well, what do you mean we have to talk to boys, or we have to talk to men about identity and working well with them? Yeah, boys become men. There is this historical bias here, and males have unique struggles too. So even when you're in the majority on an identity factor, you still have unique struggles. So you see that this is a work in progress. All right, now let's start to talk about additional multicultural leaders. So I gave you a historical lens. We start to see Lillian Comas Diaz, who talks about the dharmic path which he describes it in almost a mystical way, right? We start to see Gerald Wing Sue and his brother David Sue, who write the handbook on counseling the culturally different, right? And then Gerald Wing Sue in 2007 puts a strong emphasis on microaggressions, and that becomes a big part of his research. So it's interesting that we start to see a shift. So, as I said, in the 1990s and beyond, we start to see focus on bicultural identity. We start to see focus on multicultural identity, intersectionality. And then in the 2000s, we start to see some of this more subtle forms of oppression, right? Okay. So if I were to do a deep dive on this, I could spend a whole semester. In fact, I teach a course on cross-cultural psychology. So I'm not able to give you everything I want to, but I want to give you a flavor. Now, so what are some of the multicultural principles? Well, cultural membership is linked to disadvantage and privilege. Some individuals get more benefits that are due to their identity that were not earned relative to others, right? And other people don't get the same benefit of the doubt. You know, another principle is that we do indeed make distinctions among people across things like race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, ethnicity, physical ability or mental ability, and socioeconomic status, right? And, you know, there are some actually missing. If I were to rewrite this principle, I would include things like nationality, right? Indigenous population status, age. There are things missing in this principle. But nevertheless, we make distinctions on all these characteristics and then some. So principle 3 is that a multiculturalist stance can foster greater understanding or appreciation among cultural groups to facilitate more equal or egalitarian treatment of people. All right, so the theory of psychopathology, when you take a multicultural lens, it puts a focus on social forces, environmental forces that either can elicit psychopathology or can exacerbate psychopathology, right? So environmental forces, social forces can add unique stressors. So, for example, as a male, I will never experience the same degree of objectification of the body as a female might. I will likely, across my lifetime, experience fewer unwanted sexual advances relative to females. And in terms of sexual victimization, I am likely to experience that less or not at all, right? So when we think about it, that those stressors, you know, when I get up, I put on a t-shirt or put on a button-down shirt, and it's like, okay, well, I can go out the house, and I don't really put too much thought as to how I'm dressed other than do my clothes match. But females don't, right? So they have these social forces or additional stressors that males have, as I said, to a lesser degree. Does that mean that males can't be victimized or objectified? Of course, that's not true. Males get this experience as well as females, but it's not as commonplace. So that is a social force that creates stress among females. Chronic stress could result in some form of psychopathology. Another example, as a white male, I will never experience the same degree as of targeting as perhaps, and I'm going to bring up COVID-19, Asian Americans have experienced, right? So they have been vilified, scapegoated and so forth as this source of COVID, to the point where people think it's okay to assault random people. I won't experience that, right? That's something I won't experience as a white male. My experience with law enforcement officers are different than individuals of color. And I want to share a story about that particular social force. I am a psychologist, as I said. My best friend's also a psychologist. And we were at the APA conference, American Psychological Association's conference, when it was in Denver. And if you've ever had me for a class, you know that in the classroom, I'm kind of goofy, playful, energetic, a little bit loud. And I'm on the street being loud and playful. And my buddy, who's also a psychologist, he happens to be that he was born in Haiti. He happens to be a person of color. And we're playing, and all of a sudden, as I'm being goofy, I notice he starts to become more serious, and he's not goofing around anymore. And I didn't know why, because I'm in the middle of being, playful. And then he starts to become more serious. I don't even think he noticed it. But I look up 3 blocks in front of us, there is a police car with their lights and sirens on. I didn't even notice the police car there. He did. Now, what does that mean? His mind, whether conscious or unconscious, interpreted police creates risk of victimization because I'm a black male, right? That was his interpretation. Whereas me, I'm sitting there continuing to clown around and didn't even notice, that there was a police car in front of us, and I'm goofing around. I get that privilege to do that. I don't have to worry as much about interactions with law enforcement because of all of the issues surrounding policing and racism. He experienced that very differently than I did. And I also, when I speak about these, I don't want the listener to assume that every single police officer is racist, right? I don't want the listener to assume that I'm saying police officers are bad. The vast majority of police officers are not racist. The vast majority of police officers are just doing their job, and they want to go home the way the rest of us do. But there is a segment within the law enforcement community that abuses their power and does target minorities. I have to say it, right? So that these vivid cases create anxiety for individuals of color. So that's a social force. That is an environmental force that can create psychological distress or psychopathology. Now, so other things that we try and think about is when we are coming to a diagnosis, we try to avoid some of the standardized assessment instruments because there is historically a lot of these instruments were validated in a very homogeneous sample, oftentimes white college students, right? So there's some consideration to be had about that. All right. Now, some cultures perceive human distress through a philosophical or religious perspective rather than a medical perspective. So we have to have this mindset, right? When we're trying to treat an individual or we're trying to come to some framework of diagnosis, we have to acknowledge that, there are unique social forces that all of our clients are experiencing that we may not. And we have to be humble enough to allow them to be our guide. We have to be curious enough to learn the things we don't know, right? And so forth. Now, when we talk about multicultural competency, it is a process, not an outcome. What do I mean by that? Because culture is dynamic. That means that you could never truly complete your learning and say, now I'm competent, right? Now I have full competency. In fact, there are some people who claim that they're competent, and that creates anxiety in me as someone who focuses on research in diversity, equity, and inclusion. That creates anxiety for me. And it creates anxiety because I know that how could you be competent now when, as we said earlier in this lecture, time is going to pass and culture is going to change. So you need to always have this mindset of learning. Now, when we talk about competency in general is about knowledge, right? Whereas humility shifts from the mind to the heart, shifts from knowing things to being more curious and exploring, right? So it should be a lifelong process of learning, and it should be a lifelong process of invitation of others to help teach us what we don't know, right? So we need to allow our clients to be the guides. But I'm the doctor. I had all these years of schooling. You are an expert in psychology as a psychologist or a mental health counselor or social worker, but you are not an expert on this person's life. You are not an expert on the communities that many of our clients come from. And because of that, you have to commit to lifelong learning and openness to other people's point of view. That's what multicultural humility is all about, the openness to other people's point of view. Now, so when we talk about multicultural competencies, right? So there's self-awareness. So you need to understand, and I actually think that this is the most important part, or the first part, is be aware of your own value systems, beliefs, and biases, right? Because we as clinicians can project onto our clients biases. We may not know that. So there are assessment tools to determine, well, what are some of our biases? How do I catch my values? That's good, right? There's also knowledge of our client's worldview. So this is an aspect of multicultural competency where you're trying to understand your client's worldview. The therapeutic or counseling relationship, you want to pay attention to how culture, power, privilege, and oppression impact your therapeutic relationship, right? And sometimes it's not going to be there. There's not going to be an issue, and other times it's going to be in your face. And then we want to make sure that we engage in appropriate counseling and advocacy to our comfort level, right? So I don't think that every psychologist is going to work in social justice tasks, organizations, and so forth. But if you can't work in these organizations, there are other ways to help and facilitate social justice. It might be through charitable donations, but you can be part of the development of more egalitarian practices, right? So we want to make sure that whatever therapeutic practice we're doing is sensitive across culture. And we want to make sure that if we cannot do the social justice work, then, we at least support it, right? And in one way or another. So When we talk about APA guidelines, right? We talk about education, training, research, and practice, right? In 2002, these guidelines came out. So there's a focus on self-awareness, sensitivity, having multiculturalism in the educational process, making sure that there's culturally sensitive research, culturally appropriate clinical skills, and ways to move an organization forward. Uh, Look at the date of this. This is 2002. Now, some people have different feelings about the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in some ways, the concept of DEI has become politicized on both sides. But what I want you to see is that the emphasis on the values of DEI are in 2002, even before the acronym DEI existed. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is not a phenomenon to be politicized. The diversity, equity, and inclusion process, whether it be at your colleges, whether it be at your places of work, whether it be your psychological organizations, they're embracing DEI because it's part of our value system for about 20 years, at least according to this document and some of the research even earlier. So this is not a new phenomenon. The goal of working towards inclusivity, started in a clear, definitive way in the late 60s and early 70s, if we're going to be honest. All right. Now, assessment issues and procedures. First, right, you want to begin by sorting out any kind of biases you might have. And if you have any biases, that self-awareness is useful, because then you could either, if you're not feeling capable of working with a given client, don't take on a client that you're going to betray their value system, right? I don't recommend that. You could refer out if you can't do that, right? But you could also engage in culturally specific knowledge. It's a lifelong process. If you're trying to work with an individual, you might want to learn different skill sets. I'm going to give you an example that you might not think as a diversity issue, but it is a diversity issue. I have a client now who is moving away from their partner. And that creates a challenge in the relationship of this couple towards maintaining the sexual connection. And this is not my area of expertise. So knowing that this is likely 3 to 6 months out, I said, okay, well, what do I know about keeping the spice alive when you're geographically separated? And I said, I don't know very much. So what did I do? I started to do my own personal reading, and I sought consultation of my colleagues in my state psychological association to give me recommendations, because this is an area where I'm out of my depth, and there is a potential for me to lose the connection with my client, the therapeutic alliance, if I can't treat that aspect of what they're going to be struggling with, if that makes sense. So knowing what I know is good, because then I know what I don't know, and I can seek that knowledge out. And, I have about 10, 15 recommendations that I'm going to be discussing with my client and their partner about this, right? So that is an application. So how does it fit with culture, though? So this is a move due to work, but there are many people who are married but geographically separated, or in a relationship, a long-term relationship, or have kids but are geographically separated. The easiest application I can give you for this is immigration, right? So ideally, a family would migrate together, but sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes one member of the family might move first, or uh, a parent and a child might move and leave the other parent in the country of origin. That could create the same tension that my client's experiencing. So notice how I'm like, okay, this is related to work, but it has a multicultural application as well. So that's the first thing, gaining knowledge about things you don't know. And I love discovering things I don't know, because that means I get to learn something new, right? So for me, I love the process of discovering what I don't know. All right. We also want to, in terms of our process, we also want to avoid diagnoses, right? Because when we work across culture, many cultures have a mental health stigma. So some people are not going to receive a diagnosis the same way. So, we may not use that diagnosis in our communication with our client. We may focus, and here's my recommendation, and I've worked in various communities, including the Asian American community, where there is a mental health stigma. So one strategy is, instead of saying, oh, you have depression, because now that stigmatizes them and their families might view them differently, you might focus specifically on the symptoms. Okay, let's talk about your difficulty sleeping, right? So now, instead of saying you have depression and, that's affecting your sleep, we focus on the symptoms. And the reality is that whether we use a diagnosis or not, that's a course of treatment. So the focus should be on what the person is struggling with rather than a diagnosis. All right. Now, therapists should use culture-specific test administration. There has been more of a movement towards getting psychological assessments translated and validated in other languages. For example, you can actually get the WAIS, which is an adult intelligence scale, in Chinese, right? Or in Spanish. So doing the assessment in the language or the native language is very important, because some things get lost in translation, and that's going to negatively affect scores. Now, when you do interviewing, you might have what we call cultural brokers. Now, cultural brokers are not just interpreters. Now, this says native language interpreters, but I actually think cultural brokers is a step above this, where they're not necessarily just translating, they're also translating through the lens of culture. So if there's anything that this means, or there's a cultural value, they're going to explain that, right? So using cultural brokers or interpreters are going to help you get a better picture of your client. Now, so clinical interviewing, we have a collaborative process, right? So the process includes honoring the client's point of view, their perspective. Don't negate their experience. So that's the interviewing process. Then throughout the process, you're constantly soliciting or inviting them to provide input. And then you're jointly working together to figure out, well, what's going on and how do we address it? So instead of being just the therapist, you're a partner in the endeavor. Now, so I kept talking about the addressing framework. This is one of my favorite models to understand overlapping identity factors. Now, before I go into these identity factors, I've heard Pamela Hayes speak about her framework many times. I've written on her framework at least 3 or 4 times. And it's important to note that she gives a disclaimer. When she has this addressing acronym or framework, she says that she acknowledges that this framework would need to be adjusted if we were working in another culture. So even with Pamela Hayes and her addressing framework, she shows humility and acknowledgement that maybe this model is not comprehensive enough if we apply it across another culture. So, what are the dimensions of identity? So, age. So, when we talk about age, that refers to, right, what age bracket you're in. And remember when we talked about privilege? Privilege typically goes to adults, and more specifically, people in early adulthood. They tend to get the most privilege in the age spectrum. There is the possibility of ageism on both sides of the spectrum, as I said earlier in this lesson. So there are adverse hiring practices for people in middle adulthood, and in older adulthood, many times people are viewed as either incompetent or unable to function, right? So they're considered either confused or somehow incapacitated, and that's not always true, right? And it's oftentimes rejected. And then I told you about children and teenagers. What do you know? So when we talk about this, we refer to this as ageism or adultism. And then there are 2Ds referring to disabilities, but there are two different kinds of disabilities that Pamela Hayes discusses. And by the way, it's Hayes without the E. Sorry for the typo. It's Hays. So the first D is developmental disabilities. That is oftentimes described as either you're born with it or it's in early childhood, right? So things like intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorders, Tourette's disorder, right? Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and so forth. These are examples of developmental disabilities versus acquired disabilities, right? So acquired disabilities are, there was some point in the lifespan where you didn't have this disability and you were functioning properly, and then something happened. For example, a traumatic brain injury. That would be an acquired disability, right? So a soldier goes to war and they come back with PTSD or missing a limb, right? That would be an acquired disability. So when we look at disabilities, it could either be you're born with that disability, or it's like early childhood, or you acquire it at a later point in time. So these are the two frameworks of disabilities. And we can engage in a bias of ableism. So it's interesting. I always have an internal struggle with opening a door for a person who is in a wheelchair. Oftentimes I do it anyway, even though there's this internal struggle. But some individuals might perceive me opening the door because I believe that they can't do it on their own. For me, it's not that they can't do it on their own. It just makes their life a little bit easier. So I open the door. But you can see how, we might engage in ableism, or even, when we do conferences, what is in place for people who are hard of hearing. The nice thing about doing video lectures on YouTube is that you can turn on closed captioning, right? So if a person has a hearing impairment, they can put that on, and so forth. But are we making our practices, are we making our lectures, are we making our businesses accessible, right? So when we talk about disabilities, that's something to think about, right? So ableism occurs. Religion and spiritual orientation is another one of these factors. The group in the United States that is in the majority or has the most privilege are Christians, right? Because about 60 to 70% of the United States identify with one form of Christianity or another. But what that means is that there's another group of individuals who have the potential to be targeted due to their faith. For example, if you look at the FBI hate crime statistics, you will see that individuals of Jewish descent tend to be targeted for religious-based hate crimes the most of all religious categories. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen for other communities. The Muslim community is the second most targeted. And then people who aren't even Muslim, who were perceived as Muslim, can be targeted. For example, after September 11th, 2001, there were many incidents of violent attacks towards members of the Sikh community. Now, Sikhism is its own religion. And one of the values or practices within Sikhism is that they wear a turban to cover their hair. So the interpretation that turban equals Muslim resulted in, members of the Sikh community being targeted. And that's a shame, right? So you can see a religious persecution. Ethnic or racial identity, the group that is targeted the least happens to be white individuals. So white individuals tend to have the most privilege, and non-white individuals, Black individuals, person of color, BIPOC communities tend to be targeted more. Socioeconomic status, this is something that we have to pay attention to. The working class or people who have the lower socioeconomic status tend to be more vulnerable than people who are financially stable, so middle to upper class. So there is some bias and vulnerability, such as classism. So I think we talked about ageism, ableism. Now, with religion, it might be called different things. Sometimes it's an ism, sometimes it's a phobia, right? So anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, right? So the labels are different based on when the words came into existence to explain it. So here we might have racism for ethnicity, socioeconomic status, we have classism, right? So there is a distinction in power across social class. Sexual orientation, so those people who are heterosexual, right, tend to have the most privilege. Those people who are gay males, lesbians, or bisexual individuals tend to have more areas of target or more vulnerable to persecution. So you can have heterosexism or homophobia, right? Right. So that is what we talk about with sexual orientation. Indigenous heritage. Now, one of the things that is nice about this model is it acknowledges that in many communities, people were here before other communities came about. So an indigenous population is a community that was pre-existing any form of colonization or, transformation or one community taking over another. So an indigenous population in the United States might be our Native American communities, right? It could be our Hawaiian native, our Alaskan native, right? All of these individuals before Christopher Columbus discovered America, and before we had the Puritans, sailing and trying to go to Virginia colonies, but wound up in Massachusetts, and so forth. Before there were these European individuals who came over, there were people who lived here beforehand. So those individuals who are from an indigenous population are more vulnerable, right? National origin, again, this has to do with whether you're US born versus born in another country and migrated, right? So we can see that, those people who migrate to the United States tend to be viewed more negatively. And I know this, like a lot of these identity factors, it's interesting, have become politicized, right? So the tension at the border, right? And, the statement of that, Mexico sends their murderers and rapists, things like that. Well, that's a bias that, it's not true. What if I told you that the research indicates that people who are immigrants actually have lower rates of criminal activity than US born on average? So, but that's a form of bias and vulnerability for people who migrated. And then gender, we talked about males, but you'll notice earlier I talked about LGB, right? Gay males, lesbians, and bisexual individuals. What happened with transgender? I left the T off, didn't I? Because transgender actually belongs in the G more than this sexual orientation category, right? So when we talk about transgender, it's a gender expression. It's not necessarily who you want to have intimacy with. Now, you can have overlapping issues related to being transgender and bisexual, transgender and a gay male, and things like that. You can have an intersectionality between the two, but transgender and gender non-conforming individuals belong in the G. And again, if we look at hate crimes and we were to track them, I would tell you that hate crimes against transgender individuals has been on the rise, and suicide has been on the rise, right? So these are aspects of identity, but as I said, they can overlap, they can intersect with one another. All right, so let's talk about, cultural humility, right? So when we talk about cultural humility, we might be asking questions differently. So what can you tell me about yourself, right? What would you like to know about us? What can you teach me about the creator, right? So these kind of questions are great and useful in allowing people to guide us. Is there anything about your culture or your values system that is important that I should know, right? Questions like that, would demonstrate more cultural humility, right? So the way we ask questions would be different from a cultural humble place, right? So instead of asking, when I do a clinical intake, I ask, okay, tell me about your early childhood experience. Where were you born? What city were you raised in? And if I have a person who was not US born, I add the culturally humble questions, which are, okay, what was it like being raised in Turkey? What was that like? What was your experience like? How does that experience differ from where we are here? Are there any stressors that come from the migratory process, right? These kind of questions are not in a traditional intake, but maybe they should be, right? All right. Now, so there's nothing wrong with having conversations that are, um, talking about differences in values. Diversity is going to come up naturally in your session, but you can talk about things, right? So you also want to communicate, some kind of multicultural appreciation or sensitivity, right? So even here I am in my second office in my garage, right? And I have up on my bookshelf a dream catcher, right? If I were to go all the way around the room, I have, you know, things from India, things from Japan, things from, the Middle East, things from Mayan culture all throughout this room, because it speaks volumes about what I value. It tells the client that, hey, okay, this is a space where a person is open to new experiences. This is a person who is well traveled, which could indicate some level of openness to differences, right? But, I have my "This is what a feminist looks like" pin. Let me see if I can find it. Um, well, I have that. I have, I have an allyship flag on my office at the college that tells people who are from the LGBT community that I'm supportive, and so forth, right? So if you create space for that dialogue, it's useful. All right. So uh, it's important to talk about differences. That's what I'm trying to highlight. Now, one of the criticisms that I had of Gerald Wing Su's work in the book with his brother was that sometimes the book almost felt like it was too generalized. So even if you know general principles about a community and you have that basic competency, you can't use a one size fits all approach, because members of a given community might be connected to their community at differing levels. And because of that, you have to create space for individual differences, even if when you took a graduate level course on multicultural counseling, you learned X, because this person might be connected to X, but they also might behave as Y because their level of connection might differ. All right. So I'm actually going to pause the lecture for a second because I realize I'm running out of battery, so I need to plug in my computer. So let me pause and I will be back. All right, sorry, I didn't want to leave us on a cliffhanger. I didn't want the computer to die on us. So let's talk about acculturation, right? So when we talk about acculturation, this refers to when a person might go from one location to another, oftentimes through migratory processes, right? And it's possible that they could fully adopt the new value system, or they might have some values or some kind of spectrum about it. So acculturation is the process of either, I don't like to say giving up one's traditional culture and behaviors. It's more or less blending cultures, or creating a synthesis between one's tradition and the values of the dominant social structure, right? So if a person stays traditional, then even though they've migrated to a new culture or a new cultural value system, they stay connected to their culture of origin. A marginal identity is a person who no longer feels connected to their traditional culture. A bicultural identity is where a person becomes synthesized or blends the two cultural value system. And assimilated is where a person only follows the mainstream social culture, and then the traditional practices are lost, right? So, and then we have a pan-traditional, which is a person who adopts mainstream values, but they make an effort to return to some traditional value system as well. So it's interesting, right? When we talk about bicultural identity, John Barry is one of the leading figures in this area. And I think it's important to understand that when people move from one place to another and the cultures are different, they're going to have a struggle. There is a struggle. And what's interesting with immigration is that you can actually see different members of the family develop different orientations towards acculturation, right? So many times the parents tend to stay traditional. Many times the children are going to become either bicultural identity or marginal cultural identity. And then by the grandchildren, the third generation post-migration, many times we see an assimilation process. So it's really interesting to watch how this could occur. For example, if you're listening to this video and you come from another place, another country, and you migrated, I encourage you to ask your parents how they feel about their country of origin, which was their traditional culture, and how they feel about the host nation or the current cultural value system. I can predict that many times there's going to be a romanticizing of the country of origin. I remember growing up in Egypt and it was so beautiful and this, that, or another, and then as a child or grandchild, you may have never even been to Egypt. So for all intents and purposes, all you know is US value system, let's say. So you get the idea. So you can see different members of the family cope with the migratory process differently. All right. Now, we also want to be aware that there are different individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. An individualistic culture tends to put an emphasis on personal liberties or self-interest. There's a focus on being self-governed or being autonomous, right? Figuring out your unique personality identity. All of these things are part of the process of individualistic cultures. The United States is an individualistic culture. Collectivistic cultures tend to be more about norms and shared value system, right? So the focus is not on you as the individual, but the group as a whole. So your identity is shaped by the group as a whole. So if we were to go back to this discussion of, well, what are countries that tend to be more individualistic? What are countries that are more collectivistic? The United States is an individualistic country, and many of the European nations are individualized countries. But if we were to move to, Caribbean nations, or if we were to move towards African nations, or South Asian or East Asian nations, there tend to be a stronger emphasis on collectivist values, right? So the priority is the group as a whole. even if I have to sacrifice my own personal happiness. All right, now in terms of making cultural adaptations, right? So this, according to Geraldine Sue, is when you incorporate culture-specific variables and factors into treatment strategies, thus making it more culturally relevant. So I'll give you an example of a cultural adaptation. I was working with a Muslim male who was in older adulthood who received a diagnosis of prostate cancer. And he was devastated. And I noticed he was devastated that he was diagnosed with cancer, but he was more devastated than the diagnosis of cancer with what that meant for his reproductive abilities, right? So when it comes to Islam and many other religions, there's an emphasis on having children. And that is one of God's commandments, is to have children. So one of the biggest challenges and dialogues we had in therapy was, he won't be able to have children. Now you might say, oh, but he's an older adult. He's in his 60s, right? Oh, but he has 9 children already. So what's the big deal, right? Well, if you ever said that to, a person who is an adherent of faith for Islam, you would be minimizing the cultural value system. So here's what I did. And I kind of leaned in a way that was inviting, right? So I said to him, listen, I'm not an expert on the Muslim faith, but, I am a practicing Jewish individual. And what I know about the faith is that we prioritize life over everything. So if it meant to save our life, then this would be acceptable in Judaism. I'm not sure what it is in Islam, right? So I gave him a homework assignment, a therapeutic intervention. His homework assignment was to ask his imam, ask his spiritual guide, his clergy, to give him guidance on what does Islam say about, this scenario. And the next week he came back with a totally different affect. He was smiling and happy. And I was like, okay, well, what happened? So he said, I appreciate that you told me to ask my imam, because my imam said, just like you said, that my life is more important than the potential for creating more life. I said, that's great. So Judaism and Islam match on that. But he said something else that I didn't expect him to say. He also said, modern technological advances allow you to freeze your sperm. And it didn't even dawn on me that the idea of saving his sperm was possible, right? Because I know in many faiths, masturbation is considered a sin. That doesn't mean that people who are adherents of faith don't masturbate, but the value system is it's spilling one seed or wasting one seed. But his imam invited him for that option too. And it was something that I could have never even thought or would have taken the risk to say, because, I don't know Islamic law sufficiently to make that recommendation. So it was very fascinating. So that's a cultural adaptation. Routinely, cognitive behavioral therapists will give homework, but here the homework was to seek guidance from his spiritual leader, right? To which he did. And it resolved the issue. And sure enough, he was able to, pursue treatment to eradicate cancer, and he did very well. But that's a cultural adaptation, right? Recognizing that religion has something to say here. And because religion has something to say, I need to make sure that my therapy includes his religious value system. All right. So outside consultation can be useful too. I think I talked to you, or I gave you an example about the geographic distance and keeping the sexual chemistry alive, sexual spice. So you can ask other people for advice. So whether it be a cultural advice, you might use clergy. Again, that was the example I used, but I wanted him to ask, so he heard it himself. But I very well could have asked a couple of my friends who are imams. I could have asked them, what should I give my advice to my client? And that could have been useful too. I didn't do it. I knew that he needed to hear it himself, so that was a judgment call, and it worked out. But you can also seek consultation from people of a given culture. Now, what we find in terms of research is when you adapt your treatment to a person's culture, whether it be language or values, you are going to get more positive outcomes. It actually is helpful. Now, we talked about cultural humility. And cultural humility is the acknowledgement that my worldview is not the only worldview, and I need to be open to learning another person's point of view, right? So it's an invitation for you to teach me about your belief set, your cultural value set, right? So cultural humility requires one to have an other orientation rather than a self orientation. It requires one to have respect for others and their value system. And it requires one to not view one value system as better than another, right? So even when I talked about, my reaction to my client saying that in Islam, the value of life is more important than the potential life, I said, oh, wow, that's very similar to Judaism, meaning that there's a symmetry, an equal match. That's great. What if the differences were, what if there was a difference in recommendation? Am I going to adhere to the Jewish belief set or the Muslim belief set? Well, I don't think that any individual faith has a monopoly on truth, right? So because that is my value system, I would obviously recommend him follow his spiritual guide or religious guide to direct him on how to live his life. And, that requires me to say, what? This viewpoint is equally valid to my viewpoint. All right. So what are ways or skills to develop this cross-cultural or multicultural competency? So we have scientific mindedness, which is the process of forming and testing hypotheses about a client rather than jumping to conclusions. So if we apply the principles of research, right, data drives our interpretation. That's the reason why the results section comes before the discussion section, right? So we can't jump to premature conclusions before we have enough information to make any reasonable decision. So treat your therapeutic intervention like a scientific process. Another aspect is dynamic sizing, which is knowing when to apply general cultural knowledge to the individual and knowing when to create space for the individual's uniqueness, right? So I talked to you about the possibility of being an atheist and Jewish. Well, if I apply, Jewish values to an atheist, it's not going to be welcomed, right? So it would not make sense to apply the general value system to this individual person. I actually have another client who's actually Buddhist and Jewish, because again, Judaism isn't just a religion, right? So making sure that the ethnic appreciation of Judaism is there while I don't trample on the religious appreciation. I hope that makes sense. And then a third factor is culture specific expertise, which is the process of acquiring or applying knowledge about one's own culture and the client's culture without stereotyping. So going back to what I said, I'm not sure what Islam says about this, but I'm curious, right? So let's not stereotype, right? So you can use your cultural value system to inspire dialogue or curiosity to see if it matches or it doesn't match across culture. All right. Another thing that's important is to really, really, really bring spirituality back. If we were to look, I should say religion and spirituality, right? So if we were to look at psychology at the turn of the century, not this century, but 1900s, there were writers like William James who were curious about things like religion and spirituality. But when the behaviorist movement took power, took control in the 1920s to about the 1960s, that was the time period where you had the strong empirical radical behaviorist point of view, where if you can't observe it or measure it, then there's no point in talking about it. But in the 60s and 70s, we started to see another spiritual awakening. So the humanistic and existential model starts to really blossom nicely. And we had a lecture on humanistic psychology. We had a lecture on existential psychology. So it predates the 1960s. I want to say that clearly. But it blossomed with people like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And then we started to say, well, maybe, religion, spirituality could be useful in a treatment room. So for indigenous population, those who are from Asian, African, and Latin American origin, spirituality is a core element of one's life. So trying to cut that out actually would harm the client, right? So what's the point? You got to be open and inviting as it relates to spirituality. Not doing it isn't an option. Yeah, you have to invite it in. So another question I ask is, do you consider yourself to be a religious or spiritual person? And that person can say yes or no. If they say no, then I don't bring religion or spirituality up in the treatment room. If they say yes, now I have some questions I want to know before I bring religion and spirituality in. I want to know, well, how do you benefit from your faith? What are some of the things that your faith provides you? What are some of the stress factors around your faith? Do you rely on, prayer in times of distress? How do you cope, right? So things like religious coping. Kenneth Pergament is one of the leading pioneers over there. You ask questions like this so that I know, well, how much can I either bring scripture in? How much can I bring in, theology? How much can I bring in mysticism, right? Things like that you may or may not bring into the treatment room. But if the client finds use for it, then we invite it in. Again, from a culturally humble point of view, because I don't know every religious and spiritual practice in the world. So I know the major ones, the ones that get a lot of attention, but I don't know everyone. So there still has to be a curiosity and not an overgeneralization that happens there. All right. Now, in terms of evidence-based status, so when we talk about multicultural counseling, there is a challenge. There's questions about aspects of literature and whether we have systematic research studies, whether we have empirical data. So there are some people who push back against the evidence-based status for culturally specific treatments, right? So I'll give you one example. We talked about microaggressions, right? And which are these subtle slights. You know, there's a debate between Scott Lilienfeld, who unfortunately passed away recently, and Gerald Wing Sue on the concept of microaggressions and whether, you know, we're overstating the research findings, right? So, but what we do have, the general status of the research is that adjusting our treatment to culture actually has positive effects, right? So we also tend to see, you know, ethnic matching tends to improve the therapeutic process to some degree, right? So be mindful of that. All right, so we talked about adaptation. So there is going to be more of an emphasis on being culturally and gender-based, you know, sensitive, but we've gone beyond that, and we tend to find that those people who are trained in multicultural counseling tend to report higher self-efficacy, feeling more comfortable working with diverse population, and the clients report better treatment outcomes. So ultimately, the research consistently points that, you know, multicultural education training and competence is important. So about gender and sexuality, right? So, you know, there is a newer approach for working with LGBTQIA population. It's called affirmative therapy, which is, you know, to try and develop, you know, a sense of validation of one's experience and emphasis on, you know, being friends and developing relationships with LGBT based clients, right? So this is useful because largely we live in a heterosexist or homophobic society, right? So here's a quote from Nick Heck, right? He said, to develop relationships with LGBTQ clients, I had to unlearn some bad habits that develop as a result of living in a heterosexist society that embraces a dichotomous view of gender. I could no longer make implicit or explicit assumptions about sexual orientation or gender identity. So when you take this approach, you validate the experience of people who are part of the LGBTQIA population, right? Now, all right, so we talked about spirituality. Spirituality is part of the multicultural therapy. The issue is how to use it, when to use it, so that it's effective and not a distraction. My general rule is if my client doesn't bring it in, I don't bring it in. I wait to see how they use religion or spirituality to bring it into the therapeutic process. Now, when, you know, it is brought into the room and when it is wanted, you know, incorporating religious or spiritual concepts can be quite useful, right? And we tend to see greater well-being, spiritual well-being as a function of bringing it into the treatment room. Now, let's conclude with some thoughts, right? So in terms of multicultural theory, it's value neutral. That's so important. the more we can suspend judgment and be open to new points of view, the better our treatment process is going to be. It does entail a belief in social justice. Even if you can't do the work, there's an acknowledgement that to some degree, there have been historical injustices, and now we have to work towards, fixing some of those, right? So the best hope we can have is a better understanding of ourselves and our cultural communities, and be willing to be open and evolve and embrace other people's point of view. With that, I will stop. But I hope you found this approach, or the multicultural counseling approach, to be useful, because I see it as more trans theoretical, right? So I don't think that we just have to be trained in a multicultural counseling approach. I think that multicultural counseling, it's better if it's infused in whatever model of treatment you take, whatever model you're trained in. Make sure that whoever is receiving that intervention, it's tailored to them. So whether you're psychodynamically trained, whether you're trained from an existential model, from a CBT model, it doesn't really matter to me, because the issue of culture and multicultural counseling is relevant regardless of your orientation. That's why I say it's trans theoretical in nature. With that, I'm going to stop. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and we'll go from there. So to be continued, everybody. Take care.